In 2002, I had the opportunity to speak with a retired Russian Navy officer, Captain Vladimir Petrov, who had served on the Kola Peninsula during the same era. He confirmed everything I had experienced, though his perspective was different. Moscow believed the phenomenon was extraterrestrial, he told me over coffee in a cafe in Helsinki, using a pseudonym he had adopted after leaving Russia. Not necessarily hostile, but ancient, something that had been beneath the Arctic ice far longer than humanity had been on Earth. Did they try to communicate? I asked. Many times, he said. Through hydrophones, through acoustic transmissions, through mathematical concepts. Captain Volkov was convinced that the phenomenon was a form of collective intelligence, not a single organism, but a network. 7 primary nodes, he theorized, though there may have been more. And after 1977? After 1977, Moscow received orders from the highest levels to cease all communication attempts. The phenomenon was to be observed, but not engaged. The protocol was reinforced. The dead interval became sacred, a ritual that both sides honored, even as the Cold War intensified in other theaters. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I believe, he said finally, that both the Soviet Union and the United States made an agreement with something far older and far more powerful than either of them. An agreement to maintain silence, to respect the Arctic as neutral territory, to never militarize the phenomenon. In exchange, the phenomenon would not disturb human activity in the Arctic. It was a detente between nations and something beyond nations. In the decades since my posting at North Bay, the Arctic has continued to harbor its mysteries. Climate change has begun melting the ice, exposing areas that had been sealed beneath hundreds of meters of frozen water for millennia. Oceanographic surveys have discovered underwater formations that don't match any known geological structures, geometric patterns carved into the seafloor, arranged in configurations that suggest intentionality. When asked about these formations, military officials typically reference natural processes or geological anomalies. But if you listen closely to Arctic sonar recordings, the kind that occasionally leak into scientific databases through whistleblowers and declassified archives, you can still hear them. 7 frequencies, 7-second intervals, 7 pulse patterns that repeat with mathematical precision. The phenomenon never left the Arctic. It simply learned to be silent. And on certain Arctic nights, when the ice is thick and the darkness is absolute, if you listen carefully enough, you can hear them calling. Not aggressive, not threatening, just waiting. Waiting for someone else to listen.
Years later, after the Cold War ended and some classified documents were declassified, I was able to piece together what had actually been happening. The phenomenon that both the Soviet Union and the United States had detected in the Arctic wasn't new. Records indicated that indigenous peoples of the Arctic, the Inuit, the Sami, northern tribes of Russia, had documented strange occurrences for centuries. Stories of watchers in the deep, of 7 brothers who lived beneath the ice, of sounds that called to humans but demanded silence in return. In the early Cold War era, both superpowers thought they had discovered a new Soviet or American weapon system. Extensive investigation revealed that neither side was responsible. Neither side could explain what they were encountering. By the 1960s, the 2 nuclear powers had made a pragmatic decision: maintain secrecy, maintain a mutual protocol, and never investigate the phenomenon directly. The reasoning was sound. If either side investigated too aggressively, If either side tried to weaponize or communicate with the phenomenon, it could destabilize the equilibrium that had existed for decades. The protocol worked. For 20 years, the dead intervals maintained stability. Neither the Americans nor the Soviets broke the agreement. Both sides documented observations but took no action. Until Jackson's transmission. After 1977, the phenomenon changed. The convergence events ceased. The dead intervals ended. The Arctic fell into a silence that persisted for decades. Some analysts theorized that the phenomenon had achieved what it wanted: acknowledgement, contact, proof that humans were willing to listen. After that, it needed nothing more. Others theorized that the transmission had driven the phenomenon deeper, further into the Arctic, beyond the reach of conventional sonar arrays. And some theorized that the phenomenon had never left at all. It had simply learned to hide better.
Jackson was the first to leave. He was offered a discharge from the Navy with full honors and a pension, conditional on never speaking about his time at North Bay. He accepted without hesitation. Before he left, he told me something that I only fully understood years later. It wasn't an invasion, he said. It was a reunion. I asked him what he meant, but he wouldn't elaborate. He just repeated it quietly. It was a reunion. They've been part of us longer than we've been part of ourselves. Over the next 6 weeks, most of the scientific staff was quietly reassigned. Reeves was promoted to a desk job at the Pentagon. The facility's operational tempo decreased dramatically. North Bay shifted from active monitoring to a kind of passive observation. The most junior personnel, like me, were given the choice: re-up for another posting in the Arctic or take reassignment to a conventional naval facility in warmer waters. Nearly everyone chose reassignment. I chose to stay for another 3 months. I'm not entirely sure why. Some part of me wanted to understand. Some part of me was fascinated by the silence that now characterized the Arctic. My last night at North Bay, 3 months after the convergence event, I went to the observation room one final time. The sonar screens were quiet. The acoustic arrays were running in passive mode, listening but not transmitting. North Bay was basically shut down, staffed by skeleton crews rotating through what were now considered administrative duties. I sat in the darkness and listened to the faint whisper of the Arctic through the facility's systems. Wind on the ice, pressure changes in the water column, the normal sounds of the planet. Then, at approximately 300 hours, a single tone emerged from the acoustic array. Not the 7-pulse pattern I had become accustomed to, just a single, clear note, pure and resonant. It lasted for exactly 7 seconds. Then, silence. 1 hour later, another single note, a different frequency, but the same duration. This continued throughout the night until sunrise. 7 notes, 7 frequencies, 7 seconds each. A farewell. An acknowledgement. A sign that the presence was still there, still aware, still maintaining its vigil beneath the ice. I never told anyone about those 7 notes. I left North Bay the next morning and was reassigned to a naval facility in Norfolk, Virginia. My posting to the Arctic was officially listed as Oceanographic Research and Communications Monitoring in all public records. But I know what I experienced. I know what Jackson understood, and I know what Reeves carries with him every day for the rest of his life.
It repeated, over and over, in every frequency, every medium, every possible way to communicate. Reeves stood perfectly still, listening to something I couldn't comprehend, something that transcended language and became pure understanding. I watched his face transform from fear to awe to something that might have been spiritual revelation. The contact maintained its position for exactly 7 minutes, 7 hours, 7 seconds. that number again. Then, gradually, it began to recede. The harmonic resonance faded. The sonar signature diminished. The presence that had filled the entire facility, the entire Arctic with its overwhelming presence, began to withdraw. Within 15 minutes, it was gone. The sonar showed nothing. The waters around North Bay were empty once more. But everything had changed. What happened immediately after that convergence event was more terrifying than the event itself. Nothing. No dead intervals, no acoustic signatures, no communication attempts, no presence. The facility returned to complete, absolute silence. The Arctic was quiet in a way it had not been quiet in years. The acoustic arrays picked up only the normal sounds, the groan of ice, the distant calls of whales, the hum of geothermal activity. It was as if the phenomenon had withdrawn entirely, as if our acknowledgement, our attempt to communication, had been all it wanted. Captain Reeves ordered a complete communications blackout with the rest of the military infrastructure. No reports, no official channels, no documentation of what had occurred. The facility was, for all practical purposes, off the grid. "What happens now?" I asked Reeves the day after the convergence event. He was sitting in his office, looking at a wall of photographs and documents that detailed the entire history of the phenomenon. Decades of observations, 43 convergence events, 2 superpowers bound by a secret alliance forged in the darkness beneath the Arctic ice. "Now," Reeves said slowly, "we wait. Both Moscow and Washington are having conversations, high-level conversations. The kind of conversations that might rewrite international relations. The kind of conversations that might change everything we thought we knew about the world. Will they want to investigate it further? Will they want to break the protocol completely?" "Maybe," Reeves said. "Or maybe they'll decide that the protocol was always the right choice, that some things are too important, too dangerous, too unknown to investigate, that they're better left alone, acknowledged but not disturbed." He turned to face me directly. "And maybe they'll decide that people like you and Jackson need to be reassigned, removed from the facility, sent somewhere far away from Arctic protocols and dead intervals and 7-pulse patterns." "Are you saying we're being punished?" "I'm saying you're being protected," Reeves said. "What you know, what you've experienced, it's too dangerous. Not because someone wants to harm you, but because knowing these things changes you. It changes how you understand reality. Some people can't live with that knowledge. Some people make mistakes. Some people break."
What came back was not a message. It was a presence. The sonar screen showed something that I had never seen in all my months at North Bay. Not 7 contacts, not the standard formation, but a single, massive contact, moving through the water with deliberate purpose, ascending toward the facility at a speed that suggested active pursuit. And it was making a sound that came not just through the sonar array, but through the water and the pipes, through the concrete, through the very structure of the facility. A harmonic resonance that made every metal surface vibrate. Alarms screamed, red emergency lights flooded the corridors. Captain Reeves appeared in the sonar center, his face a mask of controlled fury, and ordered a full facility lockdown. "Who authorized that transmission?" he demanded. No one answered. "Who broke the protocol? Who compromised the dead interval?" Jackson stepped forward. "I did, sir, in coordination with Captain Volkov. The phenomenon was reaching a critical threshold. Silence was no longer an option. We needed to establish first contact." I waited for Reeves to order Jackson's arrest. to call for martial law, to do something that would make sense in a military hierarchy. Instead, Reeves looked at the sonar screens, watched the massive contact approaching, and said, "How long until it reaches us?" 3 minutes, maybe less. Reeves picked up the red telephone and dialed Moscow. When Volkov answered, he said only one thing: "It's beginning." What happened in the next 5 minutes is still difficult to describe even now. The massive contact approached the facility to within 200 meters and stopped. The sonar image was unlike anything we had ever documented. It wasn't a submarine, it wasn't a whale, it wasn't any animal we had ever cataloged. The shape was almost geometric, almost organic, almost humanoid, if you squinted and allowed your brain to interpret shapes that didn't fit any category. And then, everything the facility could listen to, it spoke to us through. The water pipes began to vibrate in patterns. The radio frequencies produced harmonic resonance. The electrical systems create interference patterns. The sonar array returned echoes that weren't reflections, but intentional transmissions. And through it all, a message crystallized.
On day 28 of my posting, as the lunar cycle aligned and the frequency of dead intervals reached its daily maximum, Chief Jackson approached me with an impossible request. "I need you to help me do something that violates every protocol we've been given," he said quietly, in the equipment storage room where we couldn't be monitored. "Absolutely not," I replied immediately. "Hear me out," Jackson said. "For years we've been maintaining silence, documenting the phenomenon, but never investigating it. We've been told that investigation would destabilize the equilibrium. But what if maintaining silence is just making things worse? What if these things are trying to tell us something?" "Things?" I asked. "Are you saying these are alive?" Jackson pulled out a folder of documents, old photographs, classified materials that I was not authorized to see. He showed me acoustic signatures from the early 1950s, compared to signatures from 1977. The pattern had changed. It had evolved. It had become more complex. He ran these through our spectrographic analysis. The harmonic complexity has increased by 400% over the past 25 years. These aren't random phenomena. This is communication. It's language. It's trying to become more intelligible to us, changing its parameters to match human auditory ranges." "You're talking about an intelligence?" "I'm talking about something that has been trying to communicate with us for decades, and we've been responding by not listening. Moscow thinks the same thing. Captain Volkov has been leaving encrypted messages in the acoustic channels, theoretical discussions, mathematical concepts, trying to establish a communication framework. If Reeves finds out, he knows," Jackson interrupted. "He's been allowing it. In fact, I think Volkov and Reeves are coordinating this. Two superpowers on opposite sides of a Cold War working together on something bigger than ideological conflict." He showed me a printout of an acoustic transmission, a series of mathematical progressions, the Fibonacci sequence, prime numbers. Then, underneath, a response. The same sequence, but with additions, modifications, a dialogue. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "I want you to help me transmit the next response. During the next dead interval, instead of maintaining silence, I want us to send something, a message, proof that we're trying to communicate." "That's insane. That's treason. That's the only way we survive this, because whatever is out there, whatever is trying to talk to us, it's reaching a point where silence isn't going to work anymore. The next convergence event, predicted for 48 hours from now, might be different, might be an incursion, might be aggressive, unless we establish communication now while there's still time."
I spent 16 hours making a decision that would have consequences I still don't fully understand. I helped Jackson prepare a transmission. A simple message constructed from mathematical concepts and harmonic frequencies that would translate across any species' auditory range. We acknowledge your presence. We recognize your attempt at communication. We are ready to establish dialogue. It was encoded in multiple formats: prime number sequences, Fibonacci ratios, harmonic harmonics, radio frequencies, acoustic waves, everything designed to say the same thing in every possible way. We are here, we are aware, we are not hostile. We programmed it into a secondary transmission array, one that didn't log its output in the main facility system. It was a transmission that officially never happened. During the next dead interval, which was now occurring roughly every 90 seconds, Jackson and I executed the transmission. The facility went dark. The 7-second silence descended, and in the darkness, Jackson hit the transmit button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then something changed. The darkness didn't become darker, but it became more present, more aware. The 7-second interval extended suddenly to 8 seconds, 9 seconds, 10, 15. The facility remained in total blackout for 37 seconds. When the lights came back on, every alarm system in North Bay was screaming.
Over the next 7 days, I began to notice something that terrified me more than any of the previous events. The dead intervals were becoming more frequent. On the first day of observation, 3 intervals. On the second day, 6 intervals. On the third day, 12 intervals. By the 7th day, more than 50 intervals in a 24-hour period. Each one lasted exactly 7 seconds. Each one was followed, a few moments later, by the 7-pulse pattern transmitting through the facility structure. Captain Reeves called an emergency meeting with the senior staff. I was not invited, but I positioned myself in the observation room and watched through the glass. Reeves was presenting data on a wall-mounted screen. The graph showed the frequency of dead intervals increasing exponentially over the past 3 weeks. The data didn't lie. Something was accelerating. Moscow reports the same acceleration, Reeves explained. The phenomenon is not destabilizing. The pattern is consistent, but the frequency suggests intentionality, purpose, as if something is trying to communicate more urgently. Could it be equipment malfunction? One of the junior officers asked. No, Jackson said flatly. We've run diagnostics on every system. Nothing is malfunctioning. The dead intervals are initiated from outside the facility. We are responding to something external. The question, Reeves said, is whether we're in danger, whether this is an escalation or simply an intensification of the existing pattern. Does Moscow have an answer? Someone asked. Moscow is asking the same questions. For now, both commands have authorized us to maintain the protocol, but to prepare contingencies. If the frequency reaches a certain threshold, we may be ordered to evacuate. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the observation room watching the sonar screens, counting the dead intervals as they happened. 7 seconds of darkness, 7 seconds of silence, then the pulse pattern transmitting through the facility structure. 7, 7, 7. Everything came in sevens. 7 contacts, 7 seconds, 7 pulses. 7 was everywhere, woven into every aspect of the phenomenon, and nobody could explain why.
Reeves looked at me through the glass. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't even afraid. Just tired. He gave the signal to restore power, and within seconds, the facility was back to normal operations. The contacts had vanished from sonar. All evidence of their presence disappeared from the automated logs, erased by systems I would never fully understand. "Log it as a ghost echo from the thermal layer," Reeves said to Jackson, who nodded without question. 3 days after the convergence, I was called to Captain Reeves' office with instructions to maintain complete operational security. I was about to learn that the dead interval protocol wasn't just American, it was shared. "We've arranged for you to participate in a secure call," Reeves explained. "You'll be on the line, but you won't speak. You'll listen, you'll learn, and you'll forget you ever heard this conversation. Is that understood?" I nodded. He connected the red telephone on his desk, the one I'd never seen him use before, and a series of clicks and electronic tones indicated that we were on a secure military line. Then a voice came through, speaking accented English. "Captain Reeves, this is Captain Commander Alexei Volkov of the Northern Fleet. We have maintained the protocol as agreed. We are reporting the same convergence as detected at your position. 7 contacts, standard configuration. Duration 42 seconds. Message received, but not decoded." I could barely breathe. This was a Soviet officer on an open military line communicating directly with a US naval base about something that should have been impossible. "Confirmed," Reeves replied. "Identical event. All systems nominal. No casualties. No equipment damage. The phenomenon appears to be running on a 28-day cycle, as predicted. 28 days, aligned with the lunar cycle as your scientists proposed. This is consistent with our observations. We have documented 43 convergence events since 1963. Each one follows the same pattern." We concur. 43 events, including today's. Our analysts believe we may be approaching a phase transition. The frequency and intensity of the events appear to be increasing. We have observed the same phenomenon. Moscow is concerned. What do your people recommend? There was a long pause. Reeves looked directly at me, ensuring I was absorbing every word. "The same thing they've always recommended," Reeves finally said. "Maintain the protocol. Maintain silence. Do not attempt to break the pattern or interfere with the phenomenon. The moment either side tries to weaponize or investigate these events, we lose the mutual understanding that keeps them dormant." Moscow agrees, but we are concerned about escalation. If the cycle intensifies, if the phenomenon becomes more aggressive, we may be forced to take action that could violate the protocol. "And if you do that," Reeves said quietly, "it ends. Everything ends. Both sides know this. The phenomenon, if we understand it correctly, exists in equilibrium with human activity in the Arctic. If that equilibrium is disturbed, we don't know what will happen." The line went silent. "We have increased our patrols in the exclusion zones. We have documented new formations, new patterns that were not present in 1977. Do you observe the same phenomenon?" Reeves' face went pale. "What kind of patterns?" "Humanoid formations, geometric patterns that suggest intentionality. Moscow believes these may be attempts to communicate." I watched Reeves' hands tremble slightly as he gripped the edge of his desk. "We're documenting the same phenomenon," he admitted. "Our science team believes the formations may be intentional, but we can't know their purpose or intent without direct communication. And any attempt at direct communication would violate the protocol." "Then we are agreed," Volkov said. "Maintain silence. Document observations. Do not attempt contact. If this changes, we notify each other immediately through this channel. The line remains open." "Understood," Reeves said. "I'll update our command. Maintain silence on your end. Affirmative. Volkov, out. The line went dead. For a moment, Reeves didn't move or speak. When he finally looked at me, his expression was one of profound exhaustion. What you've just heard will never be repeated, not to anyone, not in any official report, not even to yourself if you have any sense of self-preservation. Am I clear? Sir, yes, sir. But what is it? What are these phenomena? Reeves stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Arctic night, though there was nothing to see but ice and darkness. Nobody knows, he said, and that's exactly why we maintain the protocol. The moment anyone knows, the moment anyone confirms what we suspect, everything falls apart. The Russians and Americans will fight over it, NATO and the Warsaw Pact will militarize around it, and whatever it is, down there in the dark, will wake up angry.
Captain Reeves was the first to acknowledge that I had heard something, though he was careful about how he did it. He called me into his office on the 7th day and told me the history of North Bay in terms that would have been classified at the highest levels if this conversation had ever been documented. In 1952, he said, the Navy established an acoustic listening post in the Arctic, part of the SOS-US network. Back then, we barely understood what we were hearing. Most of our equipment was crude by today's standards. Hydrophones that couldn't distinguish between a submarine and a whale. Processing systems that filled entire buildings. He stood and walked to a map on his wall showing the Arctic basin with dozens of small symbols marking listening stations and submarine patrol routes. But in 1957, the same year the Soviets launched Sputnik, one of our listening posts picked up something that didn't fit any profile. A signal, rhythmic, regular, coming from a location that appeared on no chart. The Soviets picked it up too. We know this because they stopped one of their submarines from investigating it. We have the intercept. It was an order. Do not approach designated coordinates. Maintain separation. Maintain silence. What was it? I asked. We still don't know, Reeves said, but by the late 1960s, both sides had agreed to a set of protocols, unwritten protocols, things that would never appear in any treaty or official document, but that every command understood. Certain areas of the Arctic were to be avoided. Certain acoustic signatures were to be treated as a natural phenomenon and never investigated. And if either side detected movement in these areas, they were to fall silent for exactly 7 seconds and wait for the phenomenon to pass. He paused, letting that sink in. The dead interval protocol isn't American, it's not Soviet, it's not even military protocol in the traditional sense. It's a mutual agreement between two nuclear superpowers not to provoke something that both of them are terrified of. On my 9th day, I was in my bunk when the facility alarm system activated for what I thought was a drill, but instead of the standard alert tone, there was a single long pulse, then 6 shorter pulses, then silence. Within seconds, every speaker in North Bay went dead. Every light flickered once and stabilized. The facility had switched to manual systems, a failsafe that required at least 3 senior officers to authorize. I climbed out of my bunk and made my way to the observation room adjacent to the sonar center. Through the thick glass, I could see Jackson and another technician working frantically at the main console, while Captain Reeves stood perfectly still, watching the sonar screens with an expression I can only describe as resignation. On the screens, 7 contacts were converging on North Bay's position, not moving toward us in the way a submarine would move, not following any tactical pattern. They were descending in a geometric formation straight down through the water column toward the facility. And on every acoustic frequency, the same 7-pulse pattern was transmitting, not in code, not in any format we could decode, just a rhythm, a calling card. Then, as suddenly as it had begun,
The contacts stopped their descent. They maintained position, perfectly aligned, at exactly 500 meters from the facility. Reeves gave a single hand signal, and Jackson immediately powered down all active sonar. The facility fell into passive listening mode only, which meant we could receive signals but not transmit. The 7-pulse pattern continued for exactly 42 seconds, then ceased. For 3 minutes, there was nothing but silence. Then a message appeared on one of the communication screens, a text transmission, in English, from no identifiable source.
My first week at North Bay was spent learning the systems. North Bay's sonar room was a marvel of 1970s technology. Massive computers that filled entire walls, each one dedicated to processing acoustic data from dozens of underwater listening stations. We could track a submarine's propeller revolutions from 300 kilometers away. We could distinguish a Los Angeles-class attack sub from a Yankee-class ballistic missile submarine by the harmonic frequencies their reactors produced. But the most important equipment wasn't the computers. It was the chart on the wall that showed exclusion zones, areas of the Arctic marked in red, where normal sonar rules didn't apply. According to the official explanation, these were regions of geological instability, underwater canyons and thermal vents that produced acoustic interference. According to the other officers, these were the places where things existed that we weren't supposed to acknowledge. On my 5th day at North Bay, during evening shift, I was monitoring the acoustic array when I noticed something that made me call over Chief Petty Officer William Jackson, the most senior technician on base. On the sonar screen, 7 distinct contacts were moving in perfect formation, maintaining exact spacing, moving at precisely 3 knots through a region marked as an exclusion zone. "That's not possible," I said. It was the kind of formation you might see from a ballet company or a military drill, but submarines don't move in formation through the Arctic. They move alone, silent, trying to avoid detection. This formation was deliberate, almost ceremonial. Jackson looked at the screen, then at me. His jaw tightened. "Don't log that," he said quietly. "What?" I said, "Don't log it. Don't record it. Don't mention it to anyone. In about 30 seconds, an automated system will erase that feed anyway. And if you're smart, you'll pretend you never saw it." "But that's not our job," Jackson interrupted. "Our job is to listen to what we're supposed to listen to. Some things listen back, and when they do, we pretend we didn't notice. That's how this works." The first time the dead interval happened while I was on duty, I understood why Reeves had been so careful in explaining it. It was 2300 hours. The sonar room was quiet, just the hum of the computers and the distant clicking of the acoustic arrays transmitting and receiving. Suddenly, every screen went black. Every light cut out. For a moment, I thought there had been an emergency power failure, but then I realized no emergency lights. Complete darkness. Complete silence. 7 seconds in total blackness, beneath the ice, in the middle of an Arctic night, surrounded by nuclear weapons and Soviet submarines and things we didn't have names for. When the lights came back on, I was the only person who appeared to have been disturbed. Everyone else was sitting perfectly still, staring at their screens as if nothing had happened. I did what Jackson had instructed. I breathed, I didn't move, I didn't speak. But in those 7 seconds of darkness, I heard something. It took me 3 more dead intervals to be sure it was real. It was a pattern of pulses, very faint, coming through the facility's own systems, not transmitted through sonar, but through the structure itself, through the steel and concrete, through the water in the pipes, through the earth beneath us. 7 pulses, every time. The same rhythm, the same pattern.
What I learned over the first few days at North Bay gave me credibility in understanding what I was about to experience. The Northern Fleet at Murmansk was the largest naval concentration on Earth. By 1977, the Soviets had deployed their new Kiev-class aircraft carriers and were rapidly expanding their ballistic missile submarine,
SSBN fleet. The Kola Peninsula, where Murmansk was located, had become a fortress more heavily militarized than any border on the continent. Strategic submarines, armed with intercontinental ballistic missiles, the R-29 class with 7,800-kilometer range, could now strike any target in the United States without leaving Soviet territorial waters. NATO's response was to create a detection network so sensitive, so pervasive, that every Soviet submarine movement could theoretically be tracked. North Bay was a node in that network, but there was a problem that no one talked about. For submarines to remain undetected, they had to stay silent. But if they were silent, how did they receive launch orders in a nuclear war? This was the fundamental problem both sides faced. The Soviets had created the perimeter system, an automated dead man's switch that could launch missiles without human intervention if a first strike was detected. But how could the system even communicate if all communication systems were destroyed? The Americans had Project SOSUS, an array of underwater listening stations throughout the Arctic designed to detect Soviet submarines through acoustic signatures. But SOSUS could only listen. It couldn't transmit without broadcasting to every enemy in the region. This was where North Bay came in. Officially, we monitored Soviet activity and maintained continuous surveillance. Unofficially, we were part of an experiment, one that neither government would ever openly acknowledge. North Bay wasn't just listening to submarines. We were listening for something else. Something that both the Soviets and the Americans had detected beneath the Arctic ice. Something that appeared on sonar screens as impossible formations, moving in patterns that no known vessel or creature could explain. And the dead interval protocol wasn't to keep our communication secure, it was to keep it quiet. My posting order to North Bay Station arrived on a February morning in 1977, unmarked and classified. All it said was, "Report immediately, Northern Arctic Sector. Communications Specialist, 2nd class." No location, no briefing. Just a military transport waiting at the hangar in Alaska. I didn't know then that I was about to witness something that would never appear in declassified records, something that the Soviet Union and the United States had silently agreed never to discuss. The Arctic Circle at night, and in February it's always night, is a place where normal sound doesn't travel right. The ice groans under its own weight. The wind screams at frequencies that feel wrong, almost like something transmitting on frequencies meant to stay silent. By the time the helicopter descended through the polar darkness, I could already feel it. Something was off about this place. North Bay Station wasn't supposed to exist on any public map. It was buried beneath 200 meters of Arctic ice, accessible only through an ice shaft wide enough for 2 men and a supply crate. The installation itself was a series of tunnels carved through bedrock and reinforced steel, an entire underwater city of surveillance and nuclear deterrence. On the surface, there was only a communications dome, a helipad, and a research station that officially documented Arctic weather patterns for scientific purposes. Unofficially, North Bay was the nerve center for monitoring Soviet submarine activity across the entire Arctic basin. When I descended into the facility, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but a thickness to it. The weight of thousands of tons of rock and ice above pressing down. The air tasted metallic, recycled through systems that hummed at frequencies I could feel in my teeth. My commanding officer was Captain James Reeves, a man in his mid-50s with the kind of face that had seen things he couldn't talk about. His office was a small cubicle attached to the main comm center, sparse except for a small desk, a red telephone with no dial, and one file cabinet locked with a combination I would never know. "Welcome to North Bay," he said, without looking up from his paperwork. "You're a communications specialist. You already know that information gets transmitted and received. What you don't know is what we do with the silence in between. I didn't understand what that meant. He continued. Every facility in the Arctic has protocols. Ours is simple and non-negotiable. We call it the dead interval. At random intervals, could be once a day, could be 5 times an hour, every console, every light, every piece of active equipment in this facility shuts down simultaneously for exactly 7 seconds. During those 7 seconds, you don't speak, you don't move, you don't transmit, receive, or acknowledge any signal whatsoever. Why? I asked. He finally looked at me. His eyes were pale, tired. Because if you don't, things start to listen that shouldn't listen. That's all you need to know. Violate the dead interval protocol, and you'll be on a transport home within the hour. But before you go, you'll have a very quiet conversation with the base commander, and that conversation will ensure you never speak publicly about anything you've seen here.
47 years have passed since my last night at North Bay. I've lived an ordinary life, ordinary on the surface at least. Career in naval communications, wife, children, grandchildren. Nothing that would suggest I once participated in first contact with something that might have existed before human civilization. But the knowledge hasn't left me. It has shaped every decision, every perspective, every moment of my life. I know there are things in the world that defy explanation. Things that both the most powerful nations on Earth decided were too important or too dangerous to investigate. Things that remain in the Arctic, beneath the ice, waiting for humans to finally listen. The dead interval taught me something fundamental about reality. Not all truth is meant to be known. Not all mysteries are meant to be solved. And sometimes, the most important protocols we maintain are the ones we never speak about publicly. Over the years, I've encountered other people who had similar experiences. A sonar technician who served on a Soviet submarine in the Barents Sea. An oceanographer who documented unusual acoustic signatures. A military communications officer who intercepted transmissions that didn't match any known military system. We recognize each other. We never speak directly about what we know. But we understand that we share a secret that has shaped our worldview in ways that can never be fully communicated to those who weren't there. The official story is that North Bay Station was decommissioned in the 1980s as part of defense spending reductions after the Cold War. The facility was supposedly sealed and abandoned. But I have reason to believe that's not entirely accurate. The dead interval protocol and whatever mechanism controls it may still be in operation somewhere beneath the Arctic ice. The phenomenon may still be there, still present, still waiting. In 2014, unusual acoustic signatures were detected by international oceanographic expeditions in the Arctic Basin. The events were written up in peer-reviewed journals as unexplained acoustic phenomena and attributed to geological processes or whale migration patterns. But the sonar signatures matched, exactly, the patterns that Jackson and I had documented in 1977. 7 pulses, 7-second intervals, 7 distinct frequencies. Someone, somewhere, is still maintaining the protocol, still maintaining the silence, still ensuring that whatever exists beneath the Arctic ice remains undisturbed. If there's one thing I want to convey, it's this. The world contains mysteries that transcend political boundaries and military classifications. The Soviet Union and the United States, despite being ideological adversaries, were willing to maintain a mutual protocol of silence to protect something they didn't understand. That was a choice made consciously by leaders who understood that sometimes the greatest wisdom is knowing what not to investigate. The phenomenon we encountered, or the collective intelligence, or whatever term fits best, was not hostile. It didn't threaten us. It simply existed, waiting, trying to communicate through means that transcended human language and technology. In the end, Jackson's transmission, "We are ready to establish dialogue," was answered with 7 simple words. What came after that? What emerged from the silence? What the phenomenon understood about humanity that we didn't understand about ourselves? That remains classified. That remains hidden beneath the Arctic ice. That remains, even now, waiting for someone to listen.
If there is a silent alarm protocol still in operation somewhere in the Arctic, and I believe there is, it means that somewhere beneath the ice, someone is still maintaining the dead interval. Someone is still listening. Someone is still honoring the agreement that Jackson and I inadvertently helped forge. The 7-pulse pattern might be silence. It might be communication. It might be something that human language has no capacity to describe. But it's still there. The Arctic knows it. The oceanographers who detect unexplained acoustic phenomena know it. The military leaders who maintain classified protocols know it. And now, so do you. If you ever find yourself in the Arctic, if you ever encounter inexplicable phenomena, if you ever hear a pattern of sounds that doesn't match any known biological or geological process, remember the dead interval. 7 seconds, 7 pulses, 7 frequencies. Don't investigate. Don't break the protocol. Don't try to communicate. Just listen. And in that listening, honor the agreement that has kept the balance between 2 worlds for nearly 50 years. Because somewhere beneath the ice, they're still waiting, still watching, still maintaining the vigil that keeps the world safe from truths it's not ready to understand. The protocol remains. The silence continues. And the 7 watchers of the Arctic deep still remember the night when, finally, someone chose to listen instead of interrogate.